Could disarray in Russia mean gain for Ukraine? Although its counteroffensive has made slow progress, morale rose following the failed march on Moscow by the Wagner Group, whose brutal tactics have spilled much Ukrainian blood. The longer-term fate of Wagner's mercenaries could well be decided in neighboring Belarus, where the group's leader and thousands of its forces appear to have set up camp. And that's not the only threat Belarus is housing. To the consternation of Eastern European NATO members, Russia is also deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, with explicit approval from its authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukaschenko. So we're asking, nuclear weapons and Wagner in Belarus, a threat to Ukraine and NATO? Hello, and a very warm welcome to The Point. It's a pleasure to introduce our guests, beginning with Carlo Masala. He is Professor of International Relations at the Bundeswehr University in Munich and a member of the NATO Defense College. It's also a pleasure to welcome Maxim Samrokov. He is a fellow at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. He previously covered Russian foreign policy, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans for the independent Russian news website, slon.ru. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Marina Raklai. She is senior officer at the German Marshall Fund. Born in the Belarus capital, Minsk, she has written extensively about her homeland. So let us talk briefly, first of all, about where Ukraine's counteroffensive stands at this point. And Carlo, the well-known Russia expert Ivan Krastev said not too long ago that last year, every day that Russia wasn't winning, it was losing, but that today the same could be said of Ukraine. Would you say that's true, or does it simply reflect elevated and perhaps unrealistic expectations on the part of many NATO allies?
I think the latter is true. I mean, everyone expected the counteroffensive going as good and as quickly as in September last year.
The offensive that led to the liberation of Kherson.
Exactly. But Russia had 4 to 5 months time to prepare against a counteroffensive, and their defensive positions are very well built up. There are more than 30,000 mines laid in the south of Ukraine. And Ukraine simply is at the beginning of the counteroffensive. I mean, we see 4 light brigades trying to destroy as much as possible Russian equipment, going into what we call Jägerkampf, which is a special form of tactics. So there is no quick progress to be expected. This will take long. We are just at the beginning. And actually, right now at the moment, the Russian armed forces and the Ukrainian armed forces are a bit like two wrestlers. I mean, they are basically clashing against each other and trying to push everyone, a bit further away. We will see how this will develop, but it's too early to say that the counteroffensive has failed. We are at the very, very beginning, and the next weeks and months will show basically whether the Ukrainians are able to pursue a successful counteroffensive or whether we will end up in a kind of trench war for the next months and years to come.
Maxim, do you expect the situation on the battlefield to be influenced by the turmoil that we've been witnessing in Russia since the Wagner Group of mercenaries attempted an insurrection, a failed march on Moscow? Will that, or is that already having an impact?
No, it isn't. Actually, surprisingly, even during the mutiny, there was a very little impact on the situation on the military front in Ukraine. And now, when the mutiny is already settled, and actually the whole crisis is sorted out, more or less sorted out even inside Russia, I'm not expected to cause any problems for Russian army actions in Ukraine, because Wagner was not part of Russian military effort since May, more or less.
It does, though, seem to have boosted Ukrainian morale somewhat, because apparently, as it was happening, soldiers were sending each other messages that indicated a certain Germans would say, Schadenfreude. Also.
True, because Russia demonstrated there are strong internal divisions when actually some parts of Russian security establishment is ready to fight other parts. But still, we see that these hopes have failed to realize. The situation is already resolved without causing any major problems for Russian army.
And Marina, amidst this turmoil in Russia, there was one apparent and rather surprising winner, namely Belarus's authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukaschenko, who, in fact, in his eyes, helped save the day by brokering a kind of a solution to the standoff between the Wagner Group and Putin. What, if anything, do you think will change going forward due to Lukashenko's intervention?
For Belarus, I don't think that much can change. Yes, we've seen some very symbolic, symbolic gains that Lukashenko personally received. He can portray himself now as a independent regional actor. He is back to, the front pages of international media, but basically what it means internally is that he is becoming more dependent on Russia and on his relationship, that he relies on Putin to stay in power.
And is Russia more dependent on him?
No, I wouldn't see this way. I'm afraid that this is a relationship where one partner you can only call this partner a junior one.
And we'll come back to that a little bit later. At any rate, thanks to what Lukashenko is portraying as his peacemaking efforts, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenary force and long a close associate of Putin, is now reportedly in exile in Belarus following his group's abortive march on Moscow. Whether that makes him a lesser threat or a greater one to both Putin and Ukraine remains unclear.
Whether Yevgeny Prigozhin himself is still in Belarus and how many of his allegedly 25,000 Wagner mercenaries will follow him is still unclear. These satellite images allegedly show that around 300 tents have been set up for up to 50 men each on a former military base. There are also unconfirmed reports of 2 further camps. Strongman Lukashenko wants to benefit from the Wagner fighters. If their instructors come and pass their combat experience along to us, we will accept it. His country's neighbors are alarmed. Ukraine fears a second front in the north and is strengthening its border with Belarus. The Baltic states and Poland, all NATO members, also feel that their security is increasingly threatened. What has been happening in Russia lately, I mean the complete subjugation of Belarus, the transport of nuclear weapons to Belarus, but also the transfer of Wagner troops to Belarusian soil. All of this shows that the threat is real. Wagner soldiers in Belarus, a growing threat to NATO and Ukraine.
Straight over to Carlo. Would you say this is a very earnest and growing threat?
No, absolutely not. I mean, first of all, we don't know where Prigozhin is right now. Lukashenko said this morning that he's still in Russia. 2 days ago, he said that he's in Belarus. We have no idea how many Wagner soldiers will basically go to Belarus, if they will go to Belarus. The stationing of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons and launchers in Belarus is not a new kind of threat because Russia already had them in Kaliningrad. So, I mean, this doesn't pose a new kind of threat to NATO or to Ukraine. The big issue, everyone is expecting that Wagner might open a second front from the north to go to Kiev. And I say this is a scenario the Ukrainians have since the very first day of the war. So they are prepared for that. And 2,000 Wagner soldiers won't change the threat level with regard to that. Ukraine has fortified...
Even if they are one of the most bloody groups that has been fighting
Right, but they have to cross the border, they have to cross the minefields. The Ukrainians are prepared because they were expecting from the very first day, and I mean, Russia went from Belarus and tried to go to Kiev. From the very first day, they have this scenario that there might be basically a second front, so they're prepared for that. It's not a new threat level.
Let me ask Maxim if he has anything to add to that assessment. But also, I would like to know how much of a threat the Wagner Group and Prigozhin remain to Putin himself.
I think we have to look at two things: money and armaments. And Wagner has lost access both to Russian state subsidies and to Russian armaments. And without that, what would be able to do? It's very dubious, because the past success of Wagner was very much based on huge Russian subsidies, which Putin admitted himself, and there is full access to Russian military-industrial complex. For sure, Lukashenko is not able to provide Prigozhin and his Wagner, even if they are allowed to do so, with the same level of support. So I don't think that Wagner should be treated as a serious threat. And inside the country, we see that the problem has already been resolved. Prigozhin's approval rating has collapsed. His reputation...
Inside the country, inside of Russia now.
Inside Russia. He is no longer popular with ordinary Russians. Just several days of TV propaganda organized in the right way ruined his rating. Wagner's ordinary members of Wagner's are joining Russian Ministry of Defense ranks. They have no longer, again, access to armaments. They are handing in their heavy armaments to Russian Ministry of Defense. You have almost nothing left for that. So we shouldn't exaggerate Prigozhin's personal charisma and ability to cause trouble to everybody on the global scale.
And Maxim, just briefly, essentially, as you have said, the Wagner Group acted as a kind of, the Putin outsourced to him functions that often would normally be carried out by the regular army under the Defense Department. He's now trying to close that Pandora's box again. But will he succeed? This is by no means the only private militia in Russia.
It's also all other private militias are only quasi-private. In fact, they're all financed indirectly or indirectly by the state. And actually, of course, there were some problems in this process of regaining state monopoly on violence. And the mutiny was the biggest one. But now it's behind us, so it's done.
The only question which remains open is what is the future of Wagner in Africa? I mean, the Russian state used Wagner to pursue their interests in Africa. They are still there in Mali, in Central Africa. So the question is...
supporting local warlords in those places.
Exactly. Will they be now part of the regular Russian armed forces, which will be a new situation, because then Russia officially is actively engaged militarily in some of these countries? Or basically, will Wagner be renamed, like with BlackRock, who basically changed name every five months, and be another private military company acting for the Russian...
I think you mean.
Blackwater, not BlackRock. Another private military company acting for the Russian state in Africa.
And I think it's an important aspect because you were saying tactical nuclear weapons, Wagnerites coming to Belarus, being moved to Belarus. It's not that the Belarusian regime is going to control any of them.
Yeah, exactly.
This is still Russia that utilizes Belarusian territory basically for its military purposes.
Nonetheless, let me ask you this, because if you hear the remark that authoritarian leader Lukashenko made in our report there, it very much sounded like he was thinking or trying to convey the impression that the Wagner Group mercenaries in his country would somehow bolster his own power. And, I wonder whether that's just bluster or whether there might be something to that Lukashenko is looking at this as a card that he could possibly play vis-a-vis Putin?
I'm not sure how, if Lukashenko is involved into any kind of planning or consultations with the Kremlin, what's going to happen to the Wagner Group. He might be, that might be his wishful thinking, that since this very well-trained and very experienced troop is going to be in Belarus, that he can, again, have some gains from it, and because what comes to Belarusian army, it's not that the equipment is the most modern, it's not that they are that the numbers are big, and they basically have no experience.
And Marina, you said a moment ago when I was asking you about all this, you said that, in fact, there is one country that is very much the junior partner here, and that is Belarus. Some observers go farther and say, actually, it's a vassal state now to Russia, and that possibly Russia has aspirations to simply swallow up Belarus at some point. Would you agree with that? And would you say that what we're seeing now, what's happening, makes that more or less likely?
What we're observing now is definitely further erosion of sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Belarus as an independent country. We can definitely say that both dictators, Lukashenko and Putin, are d'accord on a lot of things, because we still see them visiting each other, that there are loans coming from Russia to Belarus, meaning that Putin is not interested in that Belarusian troops, for example, join Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian battlefield. If there are plans of any further or more formal incorporation of Belarus into Russia, they are probably not on the table yet, because otherwise it could probably be too easy.
And Carlo, if I can come back to your last remarks about, you were pretty sanguine that there isn't a big new threat here now due to Belarus. But if I can just push back on that a little, Belarus did allow its territory to be used for staging the initial Russian invasion into Ukraine. Belarus has also allowed its territory to be used as the site of summer camps for Ukrainian children who have been abducted by Russian forces and brought essentially to Belarus. And now, those tactical nuclear weapons, I know you said this is nothing new. Nonetheless, those are three areas in which some of the neighboring countries, including first and foremost Poland, are growing edgy. Still, you say this is not really a big threat?
No, it's not a new threat. I mean, with regard, look, the Russian armed forces used the territory to get into Ukraine and they failed. Since then, we have reports that Putin is trying to convince Lukashenko to become actively engaged in Ukraine with his own armed forces. And this guy, for various reasons, refused. She said everything, no combat experience, bad equipment, you know, not very modern armed forces. So,
and that the Belarusian public is against.
Yeah, this also. And there is quite some resistance within the armed forces, too, to become engaged in Ukraine. So, nuclear weapons. These weapons are not in possession of Lukashenko. These are Russian nuclear weapons stationed in Belarus, if they are stationed. We even have no confirmation about that. So, yes, if I were a Pole, I wouldn't feel comfortable to have, you know, now Kaliningrad and Belarus with tactical nuclear weapons. But the situation hasn't deteriorated in security terms. Yeah? These are still Russian tactical nukes. Russia could hit Poland from Russia, from Kaliningrad. So the Poles are under this kind of threat by tactical nuclear weapons already since a long time.
This is basically very stable instability. This is instability that we've been observing for, I don't know, for the last 10 years probably.
Nonetheless, you said just now under your breath, when I asked, does that make Belarus a threat to Poland? You said, I believe under your breath, well, you know, no wonder they're worried. Another thing that Poland says it's witnessing is the weaponization of migrants by Belarus. Belarus shipping migrants across the border, again, to destabilize that shared border with Poland, which is a NATO ally.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of crazy things in the last years. Lukashenko stopped the Ryanair plane coming from Athens to Vilnius to arrest a 26-year-old journalist. So again, this is just nothing new, and it is probably part of a psyop that it's a blackmail coming from Russia, and I think timing is also telling that next week a NATO summit is taking place 40 kilometers away from the Belarusian border, and then again, this is nothing new, but then it heats the discussions definitely.
So let's talk about that NATO summit. It actually is going to be taking place in Lithuania, again, right there in the middle of this stably unstable region. And there are some big challenges on the agenda, Maxime, including both Turkey and Hungary holding up Swedish accession, and also many member countries wish that Ukraine would now get a firm offer, a firm invitation to become a NATO member. Do you think we'll see any kind of breakthrough on either of those?
I don't think that Ukraine gonna get the firm commitment from NATO that Ukraine will become its member. It still will be conditional on the end of the war.
Yeah, exactly.
And the end of the war is somewhere in the future, in an uncertain future, and planning about the end of the war is just now has no sense. Yeah. So I guess Ukraine will get some new assurances, probably the transformation of the creation of the NATO-Ukraine Council and some other perks to enhance the status of cooperation between NATO and Ukraine. But any membership, I think, is still not on the table.
Let me ask you, Carlo, also in your capacity as a diplomatic expert, some of the arguments that are being made are, on the one hand, look, if we make a definitive offer to Ukraine, that will create more clarity and thereby deter Putin from prolonging this conflict. That's one argument on one side. The other side says that the sort of vague provisional promise that was made to Ukraine back in 2008 at a NATO summit was one of the most destabilizing factors that helped to prompt the current conflict. How does those two arguments play out in your mind? Do you think Ukraine should be given a firm offer now?
No, I don't. I mean, I agree totally. Ukraine won't get a firm offer now. Ukraine, at best, will get the message that once the war is over, NATO will start negotiating for membership with the Ukrainians. And I think this then is the deterring effect. If now Ukraine gets a firm date, this will not deter Putin. It might even contribute to an escalation because he wants to get the job done before the confirmed date of a NATO membership. Let me say, secondly, this whole thing about 2008 is one of the Russian spelled and distributed myths. 2008, the formula was the attempt of Merkel and Hollande, I think at the time, to prevent a NATO membership of Ukraine and Georgia, because the then Bush administration wanted them to be member. It was about Georgia, less than Ukraine, but wanted them to give membership right away. And this was basically the compromise formula that they all could agree on a final communique, but it was intended to basically postpone Ukrainian membership.
Let me ask you, Marina, President Lukashenko has called the strengthening of NATO's eastern flank the greatest ever threat of global conflict. Should NATO heed those words? Should NATO actually try to kind of damp down any actions that could heighten tensions with Lukashenko?
If it never helped before, why it's going to work this time?
Can I ask a question? What should he do? I mean, what should this guy do which basically really destabilizes or threatens NATO? He doesn't have the armed forces. He has nothing at his disposal to really create a kind of security threat to the alliance.
Exactly.
He's speaking to a domestic audience. He's not speaking basically to the international audience. He has now a kind of window of opportunity due to the mutiny, and he portrays himself in front of his people as the guy who's not Putin's poodle. But everyone...
He's also speaking to the Kremlin as well as to domestic audience, to demonstrate his loyalty, that he's on the side of the Kremlin, and the Kremlin has nothing to worry about him.
Speaking of the domestic audience, Marina, and let's bring it back briefly to Lukashenko. His disputed election in 2020 prompted mass protests that went on for many, many months. The opposition leader, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, is working tirelessly from exile to try to challenge him. How stable is his authoritarian rule?
So far, so good, so stable. It's as with any authoritarian structures, it's because they are so intransparent. It's very difficult to say how long will Lukashenko survive if, for instance, Putin is out of Kremlin. The story with Prigozhin and mutiny on one single day revealed a lot about Russia that probably even for the Russian leadership was quite new. There are also rumors that Lukashenko might be terminally ill. I don't know how much of this is, again, wishful thinking, but we are looking into a black box on the one hand. On the other hand, we are talking about the leadership and regional trends, but what is oftentimes overlooked that since 2020 and the mass protest, mass repressions never stopped. 1,500 people are recognized as political prisoners, and this is by far not the real number. People receive draconian sentences of 10, 17, 20 years for joining peaceful protests or just being active in the cultural sphere and supporting independence of the country. That basically the greatest danger that Lukashenko is posing nowadays, this is to his own people.
And Carlo, very briefly, if you would, apparently Lukashenko likes the peacemaking role because he's now saying he could help to broker peace between Putin and Biden and inviting them to come to Belarus. In fact, he did host talks earlier that produced the Minsk Accords in 2014. So should we somehow be negotiating with this man?
No, definitely not, because the situation in Ukraine is not ripe for negotiation. As long as Russia believes it can win more by pursuing this war than running the risk of losing, there is no room even for kind of serious peace negotiations.
Maxime, agree? Yes or no?
No sense in negotiating with him. We can just look at the way he degraded over the past years, from being a Minsk negotiator to being a negotiator between Kremlin and Prigozhin.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Thanks to our audience. See you soon.